Safer Chemicals Podcast. Sound science on harmful chemicals.
In 2022, the Chemicals Program of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, celebrates its 50th anniversary. The program aims to improve chemical safety worldwide. In this episode, we'll speak with Bob Diderich, head of the Environment, Health and Safety Division of the OECD. We first have a look back and reflect on some of the successes of the organization, before going into more details on what still needs to be done to further harmonise chemicals assessment across the world. But we also discuss the challenge of animal testing that is common to many OECD countries, and how the road towards wider acceptance of alternative methods might look. This is Safer Chemicals Podcast, and my name is Päivi Jokiniemi. Hello, Bob. Welcome to Helsinki. Thanks for joining our podcast.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me.
First of all, I'd like to congratulate the OECD on the Chemicals Program anniversary. In this context, I was wondering if you could start by sharing perhaps a couple of key milestones of your work, something that has really impacted on the chemicals management worldwide.
All right, good. I'll mention three, which historically I think are really important in the history of the OECD Chemicals Program. First, I'll mention mutual acceptance of data, or MAD as we call it, which is a legally binding agreement between countries through which countries agree that if test results are generated using OECD standards, which are OECD test guidelines and OECD principles of good laboratory practice, then those results are accepted in all countries that adhere to the system, which means that chemicals only have to be tested once and not several times according to different regional or national standards, which saves huge amounts of money to industry and to governments. The other milestone I mention is systematic investigation of chemicals. All OECD countries have agreed that they would have legislation in place to systematically investigate all chemicals which are on the market, not just pesticides, not just pharmaceuticals, but also industrial chemicals and consumer chemicals, and that they would have a systematic approach towards addressing all of them. The third point I'll mention is the high production volume chemicals program at the OECD, which ran for about 10 years, where countries agreed to divide up the inventory of high production volume chemicals through the OECD countries and perform screening, hazard and risk assessment on those chemicals. And overall, I think we did about 1,200 chemicals over that period of time, which really meant that countries learned how to work together and how to have a common view on how to perform hazard assessments and how to perform screening assessments on chemicals, which means that we have a kind of a convergence between how countries perform these things, and so we can reuse each other's work much more easily. And among the results of that program, there were a number of spin-offs like robust study summaries, which found their way into REACH, for example. So there were quite a number of practical results from that program.
Some very, very important examples there. We'll touch upon at least the test guidelines a little bit in the later stage here. But if we then come back to the present, where's the focus of your work at the moment? What would you say?
Yeah, there's a number of drivers right now. One of the biggest drivers is non-animal testing. Countries are getting really serious about moving away from animal testing and trying to find new ways to do hazard assessment. Another driver is what I call emerging types of substances, we call advanced materials, where we don't know whether they fit within our regulation. We don't know how to identify whether they fit into the regulation, how to assess them, and so on. We have a lot of experience from having tried to deal with nanomaterials over the last 10 years. But experience with nanomaterials also shows us that we can't have the same approach again for the next generation of the new types of products. We need to have new approaches towards addressing those new types of products. So we're investigating those approaches like safe and sustainable by design and trusted environment between industry and authorities. How can you move towards not having to change your regulation all the time, do new test methods all the time to be able to deal with those types of new materials? Is there a way to have a more agile type of regulation in addressing those new emerging challenges? I'll mention maybe two more drivers. One is plastics, of course, and the interface between chemicals and waste. We've just done some work on criteria for sustainable design of plastics from a chemicals point of view. Now that we've published those, the next question is, how do we incentivize the use of those criteria? How do we incentivize that actually the plastic products that come onto the market are more sustainable, are more easy to recycle, and so on? So what are the hurdles? What are economic hurdles? How do you overcome those? The last one I'll mention is PFAS, which although a number of countries are becoming very active, let's say the awareness across the world is slowly increasing, and more countries are interested in moving towards safer alternatives. And so that's one of the, let's say, flagship activities that we're having now.
Quite many familiar themes there. And maybe a bit of a bridge from there to maybe to some collaboration. So ECHA is actively contributing to the EU collaboration with the OECD. How do you see that our actions, our activities are supporting OECD's goals? And maybe if you have some examples?
ECHA has been a fabulous partner over the last many years and continues to be so. One of the characteristics of the European Union in the global chemicals management environment is that the European Union is probably a leader in chemicals management worldwide, and is trying to really push the envelope, really move ahead with chemicals management agenda. Whereas other countries are going at a much slower pace, which on the one side makes it more difficult for us to find topics for cooperation, but on the other hand is allowing us to showcase how it can be done. Over the last years, also where ECHA's contribution has been most impactful was in the development of a number of tools for chemicals management policy implementation. I'll mention a few ones. The QSAR toolbox has been from the beginning, from its design, I think in 2006, a joint project between the OECD and the European Union and later ECHA, and that has been a super successful project, which is that the toolbox is now being used worldwide by more and more stakeholders. It is being implemented or integrated more and more into chemicals management processes in regulatory agencies. So that's one of the very big success stories. The other area of collaboration, which I think has still a huge potential for future success, is electronic exchange of data. The OECD in 2004 started to develop what we call harmonized templates, electronic standards for data exchange. ECHA has been a contributor to that work. ECHA does all the implementation work on those tools. One of the immediate results of that was that the European Chemicals Agency integrated those harmonized templates into Euclid, which means now that Euclid has become an international tool because it uses international standards. And more countries are interested now in using Euclid for their regulatory processes, which means that the more this happens, the more electronic exchange of data on chemicals will be easier, will be cheaper for governments and for industry. And I think the potential for savings and reducing costs of regulatory processes through the harmonization of exchange of data is still huge. And I think we're just at the beginning there. And I'm really looking forward for continued collaboration with ECHA on that.
Thank you. Very nice concrete examples there. And then over to something else that is actually quite concrete. That would be a concrete result from the chemicals program. And I'm talking about the internationally agreed guidelines for testing chemicals. You already mentioned them at the beginning a little bit as one of those key milestones, but maybe you can tell a little bit more about the guidelines and how they support the global chemicals management.
So the OECD test guidelines are developed in the context of mutual acceptance of data. So if data is generated using OECD test guidelines and using the principles of good laboratory practice, then the results are accepted in all the countries that are adhering to the system of mutual acceptance of data, which is actually growing. We now have 7 non-OECD member countries that are full adherent to the system. So the system is not just OECD countries, but it continues to grow. And it means that, as I mentioned before, it means that chemicals only have to be tested once and not several times. And we estimated that the savings to governments and to industry due to mutual acceptance of data is in the order of 309 million euros every year. So the savings to governments and industry are quite substantial. But it also means that the scientific community agrees as to what is a high quality standard for data that can be used in the risk assessment of as well as classification and labeling of chemicals. Which means that we're raising the standard of quality of the data that is available for classification and labeling, as well as for risk assessment. And because we all agree what the standard is, all data that is generated qualifies as such, and so we're increasing the basis of high quality data that is available throughout the world for risk assessment and classification and labeling.
That's great. Then over to another topic that you also mentioned earlier a little bit. And this is something I think many people are interested in hearing about. So it is a common challenge. We're talking about animal testing. So what do you think? What can be done to accelerate the move towards kind of wider acceptance of alternative testing for animals in the future?
Yeah, indeed. This is one of the drivers of our work today. It is also one of the big challenges we are having because there's regulatory hurdles, there's technical hurdles that we need to overcome. And we're suggesting to have a two-pronged approach here. One is to increase the availability of the standards, meaning developing more test guidelines that rely on non-animal methodologies, and we recently had some success in publishing a guideline that fully can replace the animal test for skin sensitization, which uses the results from several non-animal test methods to come towards a conclusion on skin sensitization that can be fully used without using animals. And so we are preparing more of those defined approaches. We have one on, I think, eye irritation currently on the books, which may even be published this year. And we're proposing to use that concept also to push the envelope and move into more complex endpoints. In parallel, we would like to increase comfort of using those methods among regulators by having a learning by doing approach. We have what we call the case study program on integrated approaches to testing and assessment, where countries and regulators can come and showcase how they have used non-animal methods for regulatory decision making, and have a discussion among regulators. Is this how I could also have done it? Or if it was me, how would I have done it? What would I have wanted to see differently? What would I have wanted to see in addition for me to make a regulatory decision? So again, having the similar approach that we used to have with the high production volume chemicals program, where countries learn from each other and gain confidence from seeing how everybody else is doing it and trying to do the same. So that is the second approach. And of course, in parallel, also continuing to develop other types of tools like the QSAR toolbox, which is gaining traction, which can already be used today through read-across approaches for any type of endpoint, and not just the easy ones where we have alternative test methods available. So we're having these multi-tongued approaches to try to push the envelope.
You mentioned there in the beginning that there are some hurdles still, some technical hurdles, some regulatory hurdles. But if you would need to give some sort of an guesstimate, do you think we will be able to move to alternative testing methods? And if yes, when would that happen?
Yeah, I mean, among the hurdles that we're clearly seeing is the lack of reference data. We want to have methods that move away from the animal model, and we want to be predictive for human toxicology. And I just mentioned the success we had in developing alternative methods for skin sensitization, which was facilitated through the fact that we have human reference data available. Germany did a fantastic job in curating the human data that is available, which allowed us to really showcase that the method that we've developed was really predictive of human effects. We will not have that for other endpoints. What we will have is animal reference data that we want to move away from. So in end effect, we don't have the right reference data that we will need to validate our methods. So that's a big technical problem that we will face. And so experts are already thinking now how to overcome that. One of the areas of reflection that we have instead is to move away from predictivity and move towards protection. So rather than trying to be predictive of the animal model, can we develop methods that are protective of human health? So that's one of the discussions that are going on right now to try to overcome some of the technical hurdles. In terms of timeline, I mean, this is an interesting question, knowing that we have been working on this for 20 years now. For 20 years now, we have been developing non-animal methods to some degree of success. But over the last 20 years, there was never a quantum leap. There was never a time where countries said, "Okay, now we're ready. Now we can switch and move towards a new paradigm." I have the feeling that countries are now willing to talk about it. Doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow, but I'm much more confident now that it's going to happen over the next 10 years rather than the next 40 years.
Very interesting. This is definitely something we will keep on following then. Then actually moving to something quite different. So maybe something that is closer to the core or close to the core of the OECD work. So if we think that more and more countries nowadays have a legislation in place to manage industrial and consumer chemicals, this is still not the case everywhere. So could you maybe, with some words, describe the concrete work that the OECD is doing to help its members and partners? I guess there is also a difference between member and partner countries that still are adopting their legislation or taking steps towards that direction.
Yeah, one of the areas of the OECD Chemicals program that I would very much like to expand over the next few years, and we've already tried to do this over the last few years, but COVID made it more difficult, is to increase our work on capacity building in non-member countries, in partner countries. We are gaining experience, and we will be gaining experience through the next wave of accession. You may have heard that the OECD has invited 6 countries to start the accession process. These are there are 3 European countries, Bulgaria, Romania, and Croatia, as well as 3 South American countries, Peru, Brazil, and Argentina. And so to become member countries, they have to adopt a number of OECD standards, including they have to become members of mutual acceptance of data, as well as quite a number of other legal instruments that exist in the area of chemicals at the OECD, including what I mentioned, the systematic investigation of industrial and consumer chemicals. So they need to implement legislation to systematically investigate all of their chemicals. They also have to implement a globally harmonized system for classification and labeling, which is also an obligation to become a member of the OECD. And we will of course help those countries through dedicated trainings and dedicated capacity building events. So that will occupy us quite a bit over the next few years. In general, you may know that the OECD is a member of the Inter-Organization Program on the Sound Management of Chemicals, which is a collaboration between 9 intergovernmental organizations that coordinate their work on chemical safety. And they are also trying to do joint work on capacity building in developing countries. The OECD is part with UNITAR and the ILO of a global partnership for implementing the GHS, the globally harmonized system for classification and labeling. And through that, we are trying to help countries that are interested in implementing the GHS to do so. The OECD brings it to the table their knowledge with interpretation of classification criteria, as well as the interpretation of test results, as well as the dissemination of information on classification and labeling through the OECD system called eChem Portal, where countries and companies can find existing results on classification and labeling. So those are just examples of capacity building activities that we are trying to engage. And as I say, this is an area of work that I like to develop at the OECD. I want the OECD to become more active, especially in the area of managing industrial and consumer chemicals, which is where the OECD has probably the biggest expertise compared to other intergovernmental organizations.
Before we conclude, you've already mentioned quite many of the drivers for the work at the moment. You've also mentioned some of the challenges already. But at the end, I wanted to still check if there are some of the challenges that you haven't mentioned for the future years, or at the moment that you think that OECD and its member countries, partners, any other institutional collaborators should take a closer look. So what would those be?
Yeah, I'll propose that we have a global look. Where are the global challenges today in terms of chemicals management? And I think one of the areas, and you mentioned this before, is we need to get the basics right. There's still too many countries that do not have basic legislation in place to manage chemicals. There's no regulatory legislative core available in many countries. If they want to regulate a chemical, they cannot do so without going to parliament with having a substance-specific legislation. So there's no regulatory legislation available, and that is one of I think, the big shortcomings today. We need to help countries to have basic chemicals management legislation available that allows them to pick a chemical, use a risk assessment, and implement risk management measures where needed. And in the same way, GHS is still not implemented in probably 50 to 100 countries. And so I think that's one of the areas that should be a high priority for all capacity building around the world. And it should also be one of the focus areas of the new framework for international chemicals management that is being negotiated right now, the successor of the UN strategic approach to international chemicals management. And I'll mention the third one, maybe where OECD is not so much involved, but which is equally relevant, which is highly hazardous pesticides, which is probably one of the biggest chemical issues around the world, with still chemicals that are being banned in most OECD countries because they are too hazardous to being used safely. That are still being used in too many countries around the world. And so helping those countries move away from those chemicals and towards more sustainable alternatives would be one of the priority areas. And still, I mean, this will sound weird for us here talking about emerging issues. There are still legacy issues which we haven't dealt with. Lead is still killing people worldwide, and we haven't gotten rid of lead. Lead is being used to color spices in many countries around the world. So lead exposure is still quite a problem in many countries. And so from a global point of view, there's quite a number of basic issues that we haven't tackled yet.
At this point, I'd like to thank you, Bob, for taking some time to share your thoughts with us.
Well, thank you again for having me. It was a pleasure.
It's been very interesting to hear your views on global chemicals management and follow the path from past successes to future challenges. It's clear that a lot of good things have been done, but there's still a lot to do on a global level to really make chemicals safer. And this is, of course, something that we will continue following up in our podcast. If you want to find more episodes to listen, go to your favorite podcast channel.
Safer Chemicals Podcast. Sound science on harmful chemicals.